Welcome to the world of Aedyran, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello, fellow Kith, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of The World of Aedyran, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games and Obsidian's upcoming game, Avowed. For those not in the know, the reason that we're pairing Pillars of Eternity and Avowed together is because they share the same fantasy world. So as the theory goes, if we dive into the game mechanics, history, and lore of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we can gain some insights into Avowed as it undergoes development. As well, for those of us who love the Pillars of Eternity games, it gives us a chance to geek out about some things that we love about the world or learn something new about the world that we didn't know before. In this episode, we're going to be starting a series on the history of the Dyrwood. Now, I'm choosing to do this series strategically. One is because, if I haven't already told you, I'm out doing a leadership internship for 4 months in the middle of nowhere with very little internet. And so I had to have something ready and quick to go over the summer. And so this is what I recorded. The second thing is that I'm hoping to entice some people into either playing Pillars of Eternity or to give them a deeper appreciation for the game itself. So let me explain. For those of you who are into Pillars of Eternity, but you're not that into Pillars of Eternity, then this episode is for you, because it's going to give you the history and foundation for the setting for Pillars of Eternity 1. So it'll explain all the recent events and all the ancient history of that area as it underwent colonization and led into where we play Pillars of Eternity 1. For those of you who are into Avowed and you're not quite yet into Pillars of Eternity, this episode is for you. Because I'm hoping that by explaining the setting and the history behind the setting of Pillars of Eternity 1, that perhaps it will lead you to want to either play the game, or if you're already trying to get into it because you're excited about Avowed, perhaps it'll give you a deeper appreciation, and it'll help some of you get over the hurdle of jumping into a CRPG for the first time, which is the case for some of you. And if you are huge into Pillars of Eternity and you know all the lore, this episode is for you. Because one, it gives us a chance to dive in and geek out over this awesome world. As well, it also gives you something to pass on to people that you know want to get into this game. Pass this episode along to them in future episodes and say, hey, this is the setting that you're going to be playing. And if you listen to this, you'll understand the history of it. And that's a shameless plug for, spreading my episodes everywhere, of course. But you do with it what you will. Anyways, rambled on long enough. Let's dive into the history of the Dyrwood, a colony of the Aedyran Empire.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
All right, so I'm going to be reading from the 6-part series of books in the Pillars of Eternity game. There's a series of books in the game called The Dyrwood, Part 1, and then Part 2, Part 3, and so on, all the way to Part 6. I'm going to basically be taking those books one at a time, reading through it, and giving commentary as we go to explain what some of the terms mean and explain some of the context of what it is we're seeing. So, starting off with The Dyrwood Part 1, Early Colonial History. No other land has quite a wild and bloody recent history. From colony to palatinate to free republic, the Dyrwood has undergone a trial by fire to emerge as a powerful force of the Eastern Reach. The story from colony to palatinate to free republic, the Dyrwood started off as a colony for the Aedyran Empire, and then it moved into a palatinate, which is essentially that it was its own nation, but it was still technically owned by its mother nation, which was Aedyr, and then it went to free republic, where it eventually becomes its own nation. It's independent of its original founder nation, if that makes sense. And so we already know kind of the end goal of what happens here. And when it says that the Eastern Reach becomes a powerful force, it really does. The Eastern Reach is a place where all the major powers have started setting up colonies and vying for power and land and resources. And so it's this conglomeration of different cultures all amassing to this one area, and they're essentially living in the same place now instead of their nations being very disparate as they have been for all of history so far. And he was continuing back in the book. Dyrwood's history actually begins in Aedyr in 2602 AI. So to give a little bit of context, the designation AI stands for Anni Eritio, if I'm pronouncing it correct. It's the calendar designation. It's kind of like how we use BC or CE. In 2602 AI, Aedyr explorers returned from a journey across the ocean with tales of the treasures they'd found. They'd discovered countless ruins scattered through the forests, as well as plains to the north of the trees that would be perfect for growing Vorlis. Now, Vorlis was a required resource for creating purple dye. Purple dye is a very money-heavy trade, especially for the technological age that Pillars of Eternity is in. This is true of Earth's history as well. The purple dye industry was big money, and that was because purple was the hardest color to attain in fabrics. And so if you were able to afford purple-colored cloth, that meant that you were wealthy, and it was often a sign of royalty. And so just like that in Eora's history, having Vorlas means that you can make more purple dye, which is, big money for you. And the Fair Koning, which is the king of Aedyr, wanted to cash in on this industry. Reading back into the book. There was a problem, however. The locals were hostile, and there was potential for conflict. Now, the locals, as we'll learn, are called the Glanfath, or the Glanfathans. They are mostly wood elves and orlans, and if you go back to the first episode, I touch on what those races are a little bit. They are the people that have been living in this continent or this region known as the Eastern Reach natively, and now these Aedyrans have come across the ocean and are taking a look at the area and everything that there is. But as we're reading, there is potential for conflict between them. The Fair Koning of Aedyr, that's Fair Koning, which means first king in Aedyran, knew that this was too good an opportunity to pass up and sent more explorers to scout and map the area. So right now, everything's good. We have the Aedyrans cross the ocean, discovered a new land, discovered lots of Vorlas, which is a big resource that they're looking for. But there's also people living here already, right? So tensions are high. There's a potential for conflict, but he's just sending people out to scout and map the area. So that should be fine, right? Exploration continued over the next 20 years, so roughly 26-22. Small groups of explorers traveled back and forth between Aedyr and this new world, with a handful of colonists setting up small camps to establish a base for the explorers to work out of. And so you see here that Aedyr is starting to invest in this area by placing camps and settlements down. They're starting to say, okay, like we've been doing exploring, we've been scouting, we're seeing a lot of potential here. And even though there are people already living here, we're going to set up shop, as it were, right? It doesn't say whether or not they were pushing on the boundaries of the Glanfathans yet, but I'm sure we'll learn the specifics of that pretty soon. Conflicts with the locals, who the Aedyrians learned are called the Glanfathans, were rare, but frequent enough for the Fair Koning to send a small squadron of guards to help protect his citizens. These guards established a central base on a river in the western section of the woods. This settlement would eventually become the city of Dyrwood, upon which the modern-day village of the same name is presently built. So we're kind of getting some writing on the wall here. The Aedyrans have come across, they've set up some settlements, they're scouting the area, looking at resources, and there is enough conflict going on with the local natives, the Glanfathans, that they start sending over squadrons of guards. Obviously, that's for the protection of their people, which is, a wise decision to make. However, the presence of such a guard, I think, is also going to exacerbate the conflicts, because the Glanfathans are going to see as like, okay, they're willing to push back. This is starting to escalate. So now the Glanfathans are going to have to escalate their aggressive tendencies towards the Aedyrans if they're wanting to make the same level of impact. So, and that just sort of feeds off each other. The Aedyrans are going to have to protect themselves more, and so the Glanfathans are going to have to attack more aggressively, and so the Aedyrans are going to have to defend themselves more aggressively. It feeds off each other. So it creates like a powder keg for exploding. This conflict could just happen at any time. Returning back to the book, we were just talking about the city of Dyrwood, which is a place you can actually visit in Pillars of Eternity 1 if you haven't played the game. Once that base was established, the first permanent Aedyran settlements began north and west of the Bow River. Over the next 3 years, thousands of Aedyrans made the trek from Aedyr to this new land, which, to remind anyone that didn't listen to the Aedyran history episodes, it's thousands of miles across the ocean. So it's not just a quick there and back again. This is a uproot your lives and move to a new land type thing. The Glanfathans, who seem to revere the ruins scattered through the forest, caused a few problems with some of the settlements, especially those founded near the ruins themselves. This is going to be very important throughout the history of Aedyr, is these ruins that the Glanfathans consider sacred, especially to their religious views or their metaphysical worldview. Their sacred views of these ruins, combined with the attitude of the Aedyrans in this new land, lead to a lot of conflict, as we're going to see pretty quickly. Returning back to the book, we were just talking about how some Aedyran settlers were living near ruins and it was causing problems. Now the problems, were easily taken care of by the colonists with the help of the Imperial Guard. The Aedyrans, in order to further their foothold in the area, reduced the cost of production, and in an attempt to keep the Glanfathan population under control, started making slaves out of any Glanfathans captured during the uprisings. And there we have it. There we have the first, I would say, major step into the conflict and tension that is going to happen between Aedyrans and Glanfathans. So the Glanfathans are rebelling against these new people coming into their land and disturbing their holy sites. And in retaliation, the Aedyrans capture some of them and turn them into slaves. This results in a great increase in tension between the two groups, as if you had to point that out. With the population of the area growing, an official governmental structure is established by the Fair Coning. He appoints several earls to preside over the land and assigns them thanes to help them run their territories, and they call the new Grefram the Dyrwood. And so this sets up the categories and the designations of what the Dyrwood is. So the Fair Coning, the first king back in Aedyr, promotes earls. And so he takes land, he splits it into areas, and he assigns earls and thanes to watch over them and run them, basically. And this collocation of land areas is called a Grefram, and they refer to it as Dyrwood. Deer probably referring to Aedyr, and wood being because it's a fairly forested area, right? So you can see where the name Dyrwood is derived from. Dyrford, that's the village that we were talking about earlier, remains the center for the Imperial Guard. But the settlement in Pearlwood Gulf, New Dunnard, is the true seat of power for the area. The Pearlwood Gulf is further west towards, well, obviously the coastline, New Dunnard being one of the other colonization efforts that Aedyr has gone through. Sitting at the edge of the ocean, forest, fertile farmland, and a river that runs from the coast to the White March, which is a snowy mountainous region to the north, settlers flocked to the area, hoping to establish names for themselves. Aedyr began to spread across the new land. And of course, by the time you play Pillars of Eternity, Aedyrans are commonplace. You see them everywhere in the Eastern Reach, particularly in the Dyrwood area, which is where the game is played in. And so, obviously, given that this game exists and that is true of the setting, the Aedyrans don't really go anywhere. They don't get driven away. They don't get destroyed by the Glanfathans. There are Glanfathans in the game as well, so we know that both factions still exist throughout the history. But the conflict between those factions, as well as Aedyr back across the ocean, make up what is basically the entire history of the Dyrwood, the setting that we play for Pillars of Eternity 1. And so that is the end of the first book, Early Colonial History. Now, we're not that far into the history, so I'm going to move on to the second book, which is called The Dyrwood Part 2, The Broken Stone War. In 2626 AI, so that's only 4 years after the last events we were talking about in the first book, a group of farmers, while clearing farmland for planting, accidentally knocked down one of the ancient Aedyran menhirs on their land. To back up for a second, Aedyran, as I've discussed in other episodes, is this unique resource that you see in Eora, in the Pillars of Eternity world. It's something that the game writers at Obsidian created for this world. It is green and kind of crystalline in nature. It looks a lot like jade, except a little more jagged, I would say. And they're often found in these massive pillars jutting out of the ground. They're the Pillars of Eternity that are referenced in the game's title. Aedyran is a very unique substance, and it has a lot of qualities that are attached to soul energy, but we'll talk about that in its own episode. Aedyran, to the Glanfathans, is one of those sacred objects, and you would see them a lot in Glanfathan ruins. And so this farmer knocking down one of the ancient Adras while he's plowing his land, that's a big deal. Continuing in the book, this innocent act drew the ire of the native population and started what would come to be known as the Broken Stone War. So, as it points out in the book, this was an accident, or at least it was innocent, right? Like this guy who knocked over the Adra, he didn't mean to spark war. He might not even have meant to knock something over. It could have been an accident. It was an innocent thing on his part. But, as we read in the first book, Aedyrans were already taking Glanfathans as slaves, right? And they were already trespassing on these holy sites to the Glanfathans. So tensions were already high. Conflict is ready to just burst, and war is ready to happen. And all it took was one farmer plowing his land and knocks over a piece of Adra. And it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. You can obviously see that it's called the Broken Stone War because Adra it's kind of like stone, and they knocked it over and broke it, right? So Broken Stone War. When that is the Broken Stone War, was finally over, several thousand colonists have been killed, as well as hundreds of the Glanfathans. Right here, we learn something very important about the Broken Stone War, the inequality of casualties from this war. So they have several thousand colonists, right? So that could be anything from like 5,000 to 8,000, I would guess, of Aedyran colonists. Like that's a lot of people, first off, who have come from their mother continent over to this new land. There's still enough people left over that they managed to thrive. But then contrast that with the Glanfathans, who had hundreds. It just says hundreds. So it didn't even reach 1,000 deaths, which is to be expected. The Glanfathans have lived here for generations. They know the land. They know how to take advantage of it. They know how to survive here. The colonists, they're literally just trying to make farmland so they can figure out, how do I eat food in this new place? So it makes sense. But it shows that there is a massive difference between casualties. And I can't imagine that that's going to help the tension between these two factions, especially given that the Aedyrans are arrogant enough to just trespass on people's holy sites and that they're willing to take slaves. I don't think that they're going to take this "we've lost several thousand colonists" thing lying down either. Even though the war was technically over, the Glanfathans escalated their attacks on the settlers over the next 2 years using vicious tactics that left many colonists, several military figures, an earl, and 6 thanes dead. So it sounds like the war was over, but they still kept on killing. Several thousand dead, a few hundred of their own, but the Glanfathans just kept on getting more and more aggressive in their tactics. Ended up killing some really important people, an earl and 6 thanes and some military figures. This is a massive blow, and it tells you the significance behind the attacks, and that from a political standpoint, what is Aedyr's response going to be to this? Because if they take this lying down, or if they don't respond properly, properties of war would dictate that the Glanfathans could push to just take over them completely, right? So from a political standpoint, as sad as it to say, there needs to be some sort of reaction to it. I don't know how I feel about that kind of thing, but I understand the decisions that must be made in those kind of situations, and that is a hard choice to make because you have to respond. How you respond to something like this is going to set the stage for how your enemy is going to perceive you as a nation. That said, if they reacted with a banner of peace, perhaps it might make them look like, halfway decent people, but I don't know. I'm speculating at this point. I have no qualifications on politics or anything between nations or war tactics. I should probably just keep my mouth shut. Regardless, I'm getting sidetracked. Returning back to the book. Unable to stop the Glanfathan attacks, the earls elected Earl Aedyran to the position of Griff. So essentially, all the earls got together, and those are the leaders of different sections of land in the Dyrwood, and they elect one of their fellow earls, Aedyran into the position of Griff, putting him in position over everyone else, putting him in authority over everyone else. And so this guy is essentially in charge of all of it. He is in charge of all of the earldoms, all of the griffdoms, and instead of the king back in Aedyr calling all the shots, this guy Aedyran is now going to call the shots, which makes sense, right? Because they can't wait for missives to come back and forth across the ocean. They need someone making decisions here now. And so that's what they do. They get this guy, Aedyran into the position. Well respected and known to be a master of military tactics, he was tasked with dealing with the Glanfathan threat. Aedyran fought with the Glanfathans, led by an Orlan named Regd. Or Regd? I'm going to go with Regd. It's spelled R-E-G-D, and I don't remember how they pronounce things in that language, so we're going to go with Regd. Aedyran was essentially fighting against the Glanfathans led by Regd. So here you have a rivalry between Aedyran and Regd. Ooh, wouldn't it be interesting if in Avowed we had to see the conflict between these two and we had to decide between siding with Aedyran or siding with Regd? That would really be kind of Stormcloaks versus the Imperials from Skyrim. But okay, I'm getting sidetracked. The Glanfathans led by an Orlan named Regd. For the next 2 years, these two fought. Neither side can gain the upper hand on the other, resulting in a tense stalemate between the two groups. Because of this stalemate, the hostilities slowly died off, and in 2631, so that's only 5 years since that farmer knocked over that piece of Aedyran in the first place, in 2631, the Dyrwoodan people signed a treaty with the Glanfathans. Regd, that's the leader of the Glanfathans, would step down, the Glanfathans would stop their attacks altogether, and the Dyrwoodan people would leave the ruins alone. Right there, we have the first sign of peace, and it's wonderful to see that Aedyran Hedret didn't respond to, you have to deal with the threat of the Glanfathans by just burning them to a crisp or something. He obviously fought against them, but when the opportunity showed itself, he jumped at the chance for peace, even a little bit. It doesn't say here that the treaty had anything to do with slavery, at least not reading through it yet. So that still needs to be addressed. I don't see the Glanfathans not fighting back as long as their people are being enslaved, but hey, step in the right direction, right? This treaty angered the nobility in Aedyr, as it brought to a halt the supply of artifacts. So we talked before how people in Aedyr were excited about getting Vorlas for the purple dye trade, but it seems from this piece of information as well that nobility were looking forward to getting artifacts, either for study, because their, ancient ruins have ancient knowledge, right? So that's always important. Or even just for ornate designs. If you're part of a noble family, part of displaying your nobility is showing this rare collection of artifacts that you have. And there's also academic purposes behind it, so they're upset now because these artifacts are not being shipped over. So now we're having a new problem rise up. Hadrit has issued peace a little bit between the Glanfathans and the Dyrwoodan colonists, but now the mother nation back across the ocean, the Aedyran Empire, they're starting to get a little ticked about what's going on. So now they're probably going to enter into the story, and we're going to see what happens there. Aedyran also tried to get the practice of slavery outlawed. Hey, nice guy. But this was not successful. It's too bad. Because of this, the peace between the Dyrwood and Glanfath is uneasy and tumultuous. Small patches of rural violence still cropped up, but were easily dealt with, as neither side wanted another war. It's good to see that Aedyran Hedret was addressing the issue of slavery at least, and trying to get it outlawed, because obviously, if you're going to have lasting peace between these two nations, you can't take their civilians and force them into slavery. It's just, peace is not going to be possible. And that's why the book says that it was uneasy and tumultuous. Within the urban areas where there would be a lot of Imperial Guard, it doesn't seem like there was a lot of violence. It says that in rural areas, there was still violence cropping up. So obviously, there were still strong feelings between either side, but they had agreed on peace. So in the urban areas where laws could be enforced a little better, they lived under that banner of peace, albeit a little bit tensely. That covers the first 2 books out of a 6-book series for the history of the Dyrwood, which is the setting for Pillars of Eternity 1. Again, if you're into Pillars of Eternity, this is just setting the stage for that game again, and if maybe you're going to go replay it, now you have a better understanding of the world. If you're looking forward to Avowed, and you haven't really played Pillars of Eternity, as always, as you may have guessed, I'm going to encourage you to try it out. It's a great game. It was my first CRPG. I sucked so bad at that game, but stuck with it, and I'm really glad I did. As you listen to this, hopefully it entices you to play again. And for those of you who are deep into Pillars of Eternity, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed going back and looking at the history behind the setting of a game that we really love. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you think of this episode. Anything about the history of the Dyrwood. Any parallels that you see in our own history around the world. Because according to analytics, people from all over the globe listen to this podcast, which is probably just due to NordVPN and people changing their IP address. But for those of you located anywhere, are you noticing any parallels between your country's history and anything going on here? I can definitely see some from North American perspectives. If you ever want to reach out to me, my email is worldofaeora@gmail.com. Or you can hit me on Twitter, or you can reach me on Twitter at worldofaeora. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. Tune into the next one as we dive more into the history of the Dyrwood, a new colony of the Aedyran Empire. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and thank you so much for joining in. I'll see you next time.